everybody for joining us here today. We are WorkStream nonprofit, and our objective is to help organizations overcome all the bottlenecks that stand in their way towards operational excellence. So we have created this webinar series so that we can help nonprofits gain the information and knowledge they need. The goal of this specific series is to give you an operational checklist. So we're going to be going through a list of different things that you can look at. The object is not to make you an expert in boards now. It's going to make you an expert in what do you need to look for in your board. And then you can take it from there. And please feel free to reach out with any questions after this to either Melody or I. A little bit about WorkStream Nonprofit. So our goal is to, as I said, eliminate operational bottlenecks. Do we do that through trainings like these? We have some operations training programs and organization consulting programs. We also do fractional operations support all the way from bookkeeping to fractional COOs to help overcome those obstacles. Melody, let us introduce you.
Hi, I'm Melodi Bunting, and I'm thrilled to be working with Dina. We've had a great collaboration. I work for Wagner CPAs, which is a public accounting firm, and I'm old enough and long enough in my career that this is kind of full circle. I started in public accounting, did private practice, and then for 20 years I taught higher education while I raised and adopted 2 kids from India. And after that, once they were launched, I really wanted to get back more hands in private practice. And Wagner really supports the nonprofit community. I am absolutely thrilled that the partners have supported my position and encouraged the advisory services and trainings that we do.
Yeah, Wagner is a great company, and also shout out to Wagner for sponsoring today's webinar. So thank you very much. We do recommend Wagner as our go-to accountant, and if you need financials, reviews, and audits, they have an excellent team. So I'm really thankful that we were introduced to ever many years ago. I love working with Melody always, so she's been a great asset. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the team. All right, so we're going to talk about governance that works. And the goal is that I get so many questions from people about, is their board working well? What do they do? What should they be looking for? Or really, I don't get questions sometimes because people have no idea what the board is supposed to do. So this is geared towards people who want to make sure their board is effective and to board members who want to make sure they're doing a really good job. So in this, we're going to focus on financial oversight, the board role in governance, operations, culture awareness, the board oversight, and the strategic focus. So with that, Melody, any introductions?
No, I love how we collaborated and put together this checklist and the thought process that's gone into this. So I'm excited.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So moving over, financial oversight.
Obviously, one of the key things for a board is that they do have that financial oversight. There's legal duties for a board. And as a nonprofit, you cannot have ownership. So if you don't have ownership oversight, that's where the board comes in. They need to be responsible and using their expertise to oversee the financials and operations of the organization. And some of that oversight includes the things that are listed here, including approving the annual budget. Ideally, that budget should be approved by the board before the start of the year, because again, you want the board to have said, this is what we have adopted and approved. Now, if there's changes, that's fine. The board can, adopt the changes later on, but ideally it's adopted before the start of the year. They're looking at the financial statements regularly, and those don't have to be the GAAP or generally accepted accounting principle financial statements necessarily, but whatever makes sense to making financial decisions. You do need some GAAP compliance and other, tax and so forth, deeper dive financial oversight. But for the board as a whole, you should be able to use financial information that's really going to help you make decisions. Another piece is managing that risk. Oftentimes there's pieces that have not even been identified. And so we highly recommend creating a risk list and determining whether it's something that can be covered or whether it's a low risk, et cetera. And one example that I share often is a school that did not have a risk plan, comprehensive risk plan in place, never had weather or storm issues in the past, but ultimately had to close for a week because of flooding. And there was no way to address that real easily. There was this telephone tag kind of thing going on. So it highlighted for them that, let's be more proactive about identifying those risks and having some kind of plan in place. Obviously, the revenue mix, whether it's program contributions or other sources, is important for nonprofits. And again, the board can bring some great perspective and their individual expertise to helping assess what's an appropriate mix. How much should it be? And, what are the costs and benefits of having too much in the mix versus having few things in the mix? And then obviously the big piece is to look at that big picture from a strategic standpoint and say, how can we leverage what we have in the finances that we have available to steward to optimize that mission impact?
There's a lot of things in here to unpack, Melody, that you shared, and I just want to comment on a couple of those. Number one, for finances, I really tell people that like your finances should be legible. You should be able to read the story of the organization, what they're doing through there. And if there's not, you can't do that, and the board can't see that and have that transparency, then perhaps the way that your books are being kept or the way you're presenting it needs to be revisited. That's
Mhm.
actually a lot of why we started our bookkeeping services, is because we weren't seeing that happening. And it's just a really big gap. Like it plays so much into how the organization does. I think a big mistake a lot of people aren't doing also is, as you mentioned about the revenue mix, is that people are solely funded by one big grantor or don't know how to diversify or look to that. But I don't like it when any one organization is more than 30% of your budget. Um, so it's just something that really people should be thinking about, not just, oh, we got one big grant and now we're good. It's like, no, because what happens as from the risk factor if that one big grantor decides to not fund you, which I think we've all seen scenarios of things like that. And there are lots of different types of risks. Like, has anyone thought about like what happens if the key employee takes a job somewhere else? So being able to think about that, the board is coming in with that layer of oversight, that they're the parent in the room, essentially, that they are really leading the organization, and the executive director, even if they founded it, they don't own the organization. So we need to be thinking proactively about how do we keep this organization going strong and going well, taking
I
that ownership.
I love those comments. And to your point too about founders, they know program, they know mission. They don't necessarily know the other things that we're expecting a board to bring expertise to the table. And that's where it should be a collaborative effort. And just to tag on one thing on the revenue mix, I agree with you about single source, but there's been a lot of different things over time around revenue mix that you also don't want to diversify too far because that can be problematic and costly too. So it's a more complex depending on how many things you have going in your organization.
Yeah, that is very true. You don't want to spend all your time and money on, a lot of people do that on individual donor fundraising. Really, most annual giving campaigns don't bring in a significant percentage. So, yes, they are important to do, but don't spend a lot of time and money and effort on there. Focus on the bigger gifts. Okay,
Right.
moving on to culture. Culture is a fun one. Culture always starts from the top, and the top is probably the board and then the executive director.
Exactly. And I was just recently talking about the COSO framework, which is the framework that came out around internal controls after Enron and WorldCom. And culture, we don't often think of as being something we loop in with finances or necessarily high level governance, but it's an important piece of it because that tone at the top is what we're expecting the board to contribute. So, that tone at the top, are you setting clear policies about what HR should look like? Now, not that you are HR as a board, not that you're in with the staff other than the executive leader, But do you set a tone and do you look at those policies and what's expected? Do you look at the evaluation system and make sure that it's occurring? I mean, we can say it's there, but are you at least doing some due diligence to make sure that it's happening on a regular basis and that it's effective? Other things you can do to monitor that things are happening correctly to establish that strong culture and tone at the top is do some, investigation into how frequently do we have employee turnover? What's some of the feedback maybe from exit interviews, or what are we maybe running into in hurdles in employing or hiring new staff? Those can all be indicators that maybe there's an issue that needs to be identified and addressed. And then lastly, I really like it comes out of the idea of the IRS requirement for a whistleblower policy, but I like putting it in the context more of having somebody who is a safe and confidential channel on the board that employees can go to raise concerns. Now, you do need to make sure that this is communicated and set up well because you don't want them coming, griping about little issues. It needs to be something that when there are systematic or truly problematic systemic issues, that they have somebody safe to come to because maybe the executive is part of the problem and not taking care of the issue.
Now, again, that goes back to like the responsibility of running a great organization, making sure that it's happening falls on the board. And so having that safe space, I think, is really helpful. I'm curious, do you ever find that people introduce the board to their employees or like the specific board members they can reach out to? That's probably a good practice, I would think.
It is. There's obviously a little bit of nuance there because you don't want employees and boards necessarily feeling like they have open channels of communication. You do want to keep a little bit of a segregation, but it's important for the staff to know who the board is. And one of my favorite examples is when boards serve alongside the staff in fundraising events or other program events, because that's a really good context to develop rapport.
Yeah, that is useful. And I like your point also about looking at the turnover rates and that being a key indicator, because that really does tell you a lot and making sure that people are checking in. So, again, what you're going to all do after this webinar, we hope, is that you're going to take these checklists and go back and say, are we as a board doing these things? And if not, you can get started. And again, feel free to reach out if you need help. But this is meant to get you started thinking in the right direction. All
And
right.
yeah, to piggyback on that, it's not a once and done. It's an
That's true.
iterative process that you need to come back to on a regular basis.
That
So
is true. All right. So from an operational perspective, what does the board need to be looking at and doing? And how much are they involved versus not?
generally, depending again on the size of the organization, there are different life stages of organizations where this may not be the only norm. But in generic senses, the norm should be that the staff is doing the day-to-day operations and the things that go along with that, where the board is providing more strategic oversight. They're looking at the high-level policies. They're looking at the overall efficiencies. They're looking at strategic alignment with the mission. And they're aware of the key areas being obviously personnel and the finances, as well as just ethical evaluation and what they're communicating to their community. They want to make sure that things are in alignment and they're telling the story. Boards oftentimes can be one of the best communicators in the community about the operations piece. And to be that communicator, they do have to have enough information from a high level to understand it and communicate it well. And then they are responsible for evaluating that chief financial officer or chief executive director, whoever's the lead person in the organization. That's the person that reports to the board, and the board does the evaluation for, and the board sets the salary. Other staff and personnel are done internally in most cases.
So we said we want to keep it high level. We don't want the board being too over involved in that. That's what we have the other stuff for. Yes, you can have committees for certain things, but that's also something that, you have to deliberately structure your board that way. And that's, I think, a separate question. I think maybe we address that later on. But having that job description for the CEO and being able to evaluate them and say, how are you doing? Being able to give that feedback is an important thing that a lot of people maybe are sometimes afraid to do because they need the executive director, but that is their role. Ultimately, the board is in charge of making sure the organization is working effectively. Making sure the activities align with the strategic plan. That's something that I've also seen many times that they're like, oh, we do this, but nobody is asking the question, does that align with our mission and vision? So again, don't get over involved, but think strategically as if you're coming in and like evaluating a little bit. I
And
guess that goes
that's
into
what
the board oversight also. Mhm.
And one of the advantages, obviously, with the board is you're not immersed in the day to day. So you have that community broader perspective. And so you can come in and look at that mission and say, okay, this is still a valid mission, but here's how the world's changed. And maybe here's how we have to align our activities differently to deliver well on that mission.
Mhm. Um, okay. So the board oversight in general, I think we actually went through most of these before even jumping to that category. But yeah, avoiding the involvement in day to day, I have seen just so many times how that really slows people down. All the hiring below the executive direct level goes to the executive director or HR. Um, and the communication, I'll let you talk more about that.
It's important that the communication generally in most structures is going from board through ED, not directly with staff. Now, there's exceptions, there's committees, there's different sizes. But again, you kind of want that clear boundaries and buckets of who's oversight and who's operational. Because if those lines get blurred sometimes, we're not necessarily adhering to the best practices of making sure the commitments that need to be done in each of those sides are actually happening. Now, again, there's always exceptions, but ideally you want the ED to be well informed and the ED to be forthright in passing along information to the board.
Mm-hmm. Uh, yes. So that ED is the connector. Now, I know you've mentioned to me that the chair is the one who's supposed to be preparing the agendas and things like that and taking ownership. All the nonprofits I've spoken to, really, it's the executive director who's doing this, which is not the way it should be.
If you have a really high functioning board, the board and the ED have a really strong working relationship, and the ED is going to help that board chair understand what the key issues are. But remember, the board should be coming from a different perspective, so they should be making the agenda. Yes, addressing in their high level what is of concern in immediacy to the ED, but the ED is not in charge of the board, and there should be somewhat of a segregation there. And that goes to what we talk about too with founders, because oftentimes your founder might be your executive director and they have a passion and they have great vision, but there you've got to have some points where there's a segregation from my passion for the people we serve and what we're doing versus that high level perspective and strategic oversight.
Yeah, and it's really important to always have that. In my work, I've always, a lot of coming in as an operations consultant is sometimes just providing what I call business therapy and just being that external perspective to view that all. Um, and so having that external board coming in is really, really, really helpful for that and use it. Now I was actually preparing some 990s for some clients this morning, and this last point of identifying and disclosing board member conflicts of interest, they ask you if you do that, if you have a conflict of interest policy. So for one client, we had to say, no, we don't have one. We should.
That to me is a mandatory should be yes question. Now to file a 1023 to actually get nonprofit status, you have to submit a conflict of interest policy with your application. So anyone that has been a nonprofit for a while that doesn't have it, you should be seeing this as an imperative because that's a red flag to the IRS and users of the 990.
Okay, yeah. So absolutely make sure it's there. But remember, all these are questions that you're going back to your board and saying, do we have these? For all I know, I should go back to that client and say, if you filed recently, you probably do have it. But then people should know where it is and you should come back to it and refresh it and make sure that people aren't um,
And
finding
ideally,
conflict.
you have board members sign off that they've read it and there are no conflicts or identify what those conflicts are at least once a year.
Strategy. What is the board's role in regards to strategy?
Well, they're obviously not on their own island either in developing this strategy that, they don't know all the ins and outs of developing the program, but they have, as I've been saying throughout, that different perspective where they can look at, okay, here's what our mission impact is, and what could we do differently strategically, and help facilitate those conversations as well as inserting their expertise and various levels of strategic skills to create a strategic plan and then have ways to measure if they're hitting that. So, for instance, if I'm a food pantry, program, people know we're feeding the community, we have these things coming in, they know how the process works. But if I'm strategic and taking a step back, am I saying, are there food islands we haven't addressed? Is the current system working well and the families getting what they need? How can we measure our effectiveness of developing food that is enhancing education benefits and health of the communities that need them? So again, it's more that strategic and higher level, if you will, of bringing in some of that perspective that they have. And then looking at, how can we continue to be an enhancement to our community? Using the example that I just shared, it can make a really big difference when we address some of those things. But I've seen in one example, an organ or a location that had a great food pantry, but they also had a large enough metropolitan area that there were a number of food deserts. And so it needed a board to take a step back and say, okay, yeah, what we're doing is our nonprofit is great, but there's still a lot of great need in the community. And then we want to make sure that we're oversighting quality control to make sure, just like any for-profit or nonprofit business, that we're doing it and we're doing it well, and we're not just flying without some kind of guardrails to what we want to have established.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the nonprofits we see are very busy with what they are doing and
Mhm.
not really thinking the why. And it's hard to be in the why phase while you're focused on doing, and everyone's usually very constrained and bootstrapping as much as they can. So being able to, again, have that external person come in who's not tied in to all the day-to-day stuff to think, are we really achieving what we want to be? And are we solving hunger in this area if that's our goal? Not just how many meals did we put out, but are we really getting to our core? And then they can find things that, oh, we can measure that, which area, how many food deserts there are, and how many are we removing. So focusing on the right details. And this takes thought.
Mhm.
It's very rare that I encounter an organization who's put enough thought into it. But it doesn't need to be the executive director who takes all this on themselves. You have the board should be helping you with this and the strategic aspect. And really, the board that you're bringing in should be experts that you're leaning in. Like every person on there should be contributing something of value. These are all the things we want the board to be thinking about and helping you with. Every board member should be there for a purpose.
And there's often been this board requirement to make some kind of contribution. And I'm not opposed to that. But the problem with it always being a monetary contribution is that sometimes then you don't have the diversity on the board that you need. So I like to broaden that to say, okay, what kind of other information and resources and expertise do I bring to the board that's contributing to our bigger alignment with the community that we're serving in to make sure we're accomplishing more than just checking the boxes.
Yeah, I would say that it's more important than giving financial donations that they're giving some time donations or guidance donations.
Mhm.
That's more important. Legally, this is probably a hard one for a lot of boards, compliance, because we hired somebody on staff just to deal with compliance because it gets that complicated, especially when you're working with multiple states. Um, but the board is responsible to make sure it all happens. So what's our checklist? Let's go through our checklist of how do we make sure and make it easy for the board to make sure the organization stays in compliance.
This is one where, unless you have somebody who is really deep in law specifics or finance specifics, you're probably going to have to leverage some outside expertise as well. But the role of the board then is to continue to ask the questions. Okay, we are now having, for instance, remote employees. How does that impact our compliance in those states? Those are the kind of things I would expect a board to be questioning and to be saying, okay, who do we need to contact to make sure that we're in compliance? The the staff is not going to think about everything again. They're doing that operation, getting the staffing that they need in my example. But the board then should be taking that higher level look and saying, great, but what do we have to make sure we're complying with? The biggest compliance piece for the board are the bylaws. The bylaws are the rule book for how the board operates. And unfortunately, in my experience, a number of nonprofits don't even know where they are, or they haven't been reviewed for years and they're not in compliance. So one of the regular annual practices that I love to encourage is looking at those bylaws and just making sure they're current. And if need be, you update them. I also encourage creating some kind of entity calendar that helps you with all of these potential filings and compliance pieces, especially since now it's multi-state in a lot of cases, like Dina mentioned, that there's so much to keep track of. So do we have some kind of methodology to support that and make sure that they're all getting addressed? And then the last one on here with the minutes is important because the IRS, one of the first things they'll look at if they ever examine the organization is governance, and they'll look at those minutes. I've also heard from a number of bankers that have emphasized, yeah, we want the financials, but we care a lot about governance and those soft skills, which they're interpreting as leadership. So it's important to have documentation around what the board's doing.
Yeah, minutes is probably something that, I mean, it's easy enough to do. You have a Google Doc during the meeting, write the minutes down, make sure someone's doing that. It is another question they ask you on that 990, so make sure you have those. And I love the idea of having a calendar wherever it goes, your task management system, something that is the most useful thing to do. So you're like doing your research once and then you put it on a calendar. You don't have to remember about that. And the board doesn't need to be an expert in it at all. They just need to make sure that it's happening and that somebody's taking care of it.
Exactly.
That
The
shouldn't
one
scare
other
you.
thing I want to mention about the minutes, though, is Google, what are the legal requirements? Because you want to make sure that all of those are in there, that it's not just, an informal memo or chat. And one thing importantly is having it actually physically signed, because
That
otherwise,
most
who's the
people are
proof?
not doing. Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing that people need to realize. I
Yep.
do wonder if like the AI companion or all the other note takers we have serve as minutes. That would be an interesting thing to look into.
At the moment, my research tells me they're not to the point we want to use them for a whole bunch of other risk limitations, but it could be definitely something that could be of service in the near future.
Okay. Well, that is interesting. All right. So moving on to our last slide about the board roles and governance. And there's so much to talk about in here. Um, but let's do the first section about defining board member terms and the board job descriptions. I'm a big fan of those.
The board, remember, is its own entity. They don't report to themselves. They're not reporting to somebody else. So they need to have clear guidelines and, for lack of a better word, rules for how they're going to conduct business. So have they addressed those member terms? Do the member terms still agree to the bylaw? Do they have job descriptions? Because there are expectations. Are those expectations documented?
Yeah,
How
remember, every board member is there for a reason. So, what is the reason that you have them there? And do they know that? And is it in writing?
excellent. And looking at board size, now I have all kinds of tangents I could go there, but there is no one size fits all. At a minimum, legally, you need three in pretty much all states. But decide then how is it best going to be that you actually collaborate and you use your board meeting time effectively to do these higher level oversight roles? What's that optimal size? And what could we potentially shift to committees, either permanent committees or temporary committees? Because there are changing circumstances that need to be addressed. And I love having an audit or an executive committee that does that deeper dive in some of the compliance and accounting issues because not everybody understands that. And the board as a whole is going to glaze over if that
That's
has
so
to be
true.
addressed by everybody.
Yeah, that is very true.
We mentioned the one about the meeting agenda, and we've talked a lot about focusing on strategy versus operational details. But other things in that first category there?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of them we talked about that. So, yeah, just another couple things I wanted to mention. Defining the board member terms. You don't want it to be too long of a commitment that you're going to scare people off. You don't want to be too short that there's constant rollover and no one could be there. We want terms because if um, we get new blood in always, we get new perspectives. And if we have people who are challenging board members, there's a natural exit for them as well. So a lot of reasons why it's a term. I think typically 2 to 3 years is the recommended term limit.
Yes, yes.
I know I do 2 years for mine, but they have the option to renew if we all agree on it. Yeah, and the board size, I've also seen organizations with like all committees and their board is 30 people big. You do not need to have that. You can have a committee and they're not on the board. That's fine. They're just called volunteers. So just be a little bit more strategic. People on the board are the ones who are going to be involved in everything. Um, yeah. And
And
again,
you,
stay out of operations.
how you just said that it hit something in my own brain is I love the idea of keeping the board size small and again with those committees, but you could have certain board meetings where you're inviting whole committees in or other things to collaborate with the board and to bring it in that higher level.
Yeah. Now, the last one, we want the board chair, not the ED, driving the meeting agenda, which we had talked about earlier. But I also think that there are some points about what we should be including on the agenda. Sometimes we have some more sensitive details also that we can
Yep.
talk more about that.
Sure. One of the things I encourage is every agenda and minutes to have towards, usually towards the bottom, but it doesn't have to be, something that says executive session. Because then if there are things where guests that are at the meeting or other committee members or other people cannot be part of a very confidential conversation, whether it's financial or personnel issue or whatever, that executive session is designed for that confidential information. And if it's a regular item on the agenda and minutes, nobody panics when they see it. If it only shows up when there's a problem, guess what? It stirs the rumor mill.
So make sure to keep those on there. I love that idea. And it's really important. And again, speaks to, especially imagine if you have an executive director issue and you need the board to talk about that without there. So again, if the board chair is the one driving the agenda and driving the meetings, it's a natural way to make sure we're always talking about what we need to. And make templates for your board agendas. They usually follow the same flow usually. If
Mhm.
anyone needs a template, you can reach out to me and I will share mine with you.
And
Um,
just like other agenda items, that executive session doesn't have to be used. I mean, we don't always touch on every agenda item every
mhm.
single time.
Yeah, exactly. Diversity.
I think it's really important to reflect the community that you're in and having some input from, even maybe potentially the people that you serve. And that's where the whole idea of a board member having to have a financial contribution can be limiting. And my personal tends towards diversity and figuring out other ways that board members can contribute versus just finances. Because I like to see that broad perspective of people that represent the community that we're serving, as well as expertise areas that we're looking at. And having diversity can foster better conversations and encourage accountability, and maybe expanding somebody even on the board, expanding their understanding and desire to dig deeper or learn something different. So I love it when the board, like I said earlier, encourages active community and volunteering, and that being the way that they're donating, maybe dollars additionally, but definitely by participation. And then holding accountable to each other. And maybe that actually requires some periodic evaluations or conversations. Because sometimes you have, a person who is not on track, and rather than pointing fingers, some kind of evaluation tool would be a great way to address the concern.
Hmm. Yeah. So if we create the job descriptions, we have a general evaluation that's probably led by the board chair. We have a diverse room so that we're not in an echo chamber, that we can bring new ideas. That's what diversity in general includes. That's the representative sampling of people that you're targeting, also trying to work with. Like if you're working with housing or with food, you want people who have struggled with
Mhm.
housing or not able to access food on the board to help them advise and give their opinions. It's really important, not just people who can donate to it, because then you won't hear from the right side of it. Um, yeah, and then holding people accountable to their role. Every person should be working for you. And if they're not contributing, they don't belong there.
Make sure that part of your expectations in those written job descriptions or invites to be on the board is, this is not a board where you come and just sit and listen. You are required to actively participate.
Yeah. And you can be a little, you don't have to make them work too hard. Like sometimes the point of the board is to be strategic. We're going to have the natural evolution of the board. So, for example, my board, they're a strategic board where that we meet once every 6 months because I don't need strategy advice as often.
Mhm.
And they all have insights into the nonprofit community and they can share them with me. And that is how they help me. Other organizations meet monthly because they're doing more of the governance and guidance on a monthly basis that needs to, and they're supporting the executive director that way. Some
Mhm.
people meet on a quarterly. So the question is, what is the purpose? Are you a working board? Are you a strategic board? Are you an advisory board? Whatever it is, it's clear and it's doing something for you.
But in all cases, there should be some active participation, even to your point. It doesn't have to be at a
Yes.
necessarily meeting. Maybe it's somebody the ED feels comfortable reaching out to at periodic times.
Right.
Don't just come and join a board because you want to put it on your resume and sit quietly in the corner.
Yeah, you need to be participating and giving. All my board members are participating and giving, and people that we bring in often. So yeah, it's not just to be on somebody's resume. It's they're doing something for you.
Yep,
That is always the question that we are asking. All right. Well, thank you, Melody.
of course.
This has been really helpful. And for everybody, just so you know, we have our next sessions. The goal is to do checklists, just like what we have here. So you'll see a similar format. We have our next 5 sessions. This is our year's programming on finance is coming up next. Really from the operational perspective, budgeting and money management. Then we move into compliance and HR risks and benefits. Um, then we move into HR, all the things you need to know to build your dream team, and then a workflow optimization for scaling systems and fundraising systems. So, again, thank you very much. Please, we're going to send you the link to the survey to let us know what helped you the most, what was the most effective. We love feedback, we love takeaways. I hope that this session has been helpful for you. And please reach out to Melody or me if you have any questions at all. We are here to support. Um, and I can assure you, Melody is lovely to work with. So, any questions at all, please let us know. So thank you.
Same for Dina. She's lovely to work with too.
Thank you.